welcome back to the mini lecture series for Lemoore Union High School Biology for Engineering Pathway students. This mini lecture is going to be focusing on the theory of evolution and primarily looking at evidence that exists to support that theory. We'll get into Charles Darwin and how he came up with this idea much deeper later on, probably next week. But right now, I want to go ahead and get into the evidence that supports this theory and make sure that you really understand what the theory of evolution is all about. So let's get started. So when we're talking about the theory of evolution, I'm sure that you have quite a few ideas about this already. But we're going to go a little bit deeper and find out really what it is, where is the evidence that supports this idea that Charles Darwin came up with, how is it supported? And if it's something that takes so long to happen, where is the evidence for evolution? So we're going to dig into looking at what are those pieces of evidence. How does evolution actually occur? What forces it to happen? And how do we get the formation of new species? What is this process called natural selection? I'm sure you've heard of artificial selection where we decide who breeds, but how does it work with natural selection? And how does that then in turn create the new species that we see, the process of speciation? So as we begin, we're going to go ahead and start by looking at Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin was an English scientist. He lived from about 1809 to 1882, and he is the person that proposed the actual theory of evolution. Now, evolution is a gradual change in a species through adaptations, changes over time. So he equated the theory of evolution with natural selection. Now, natural selection in itself is organisms with traits that are well suited to an environment are more likely to survive and produce more offspring than organisms without these favorable traits. I'm sure you've heard the expression, only the strong survive. Actually, only the fittest survive. And in the case of evolution, the fittest are who has the most offspring. And these favorable traits will then be passed on to the offspring so that they can survive to have their own offspring. What makes you the most fit is how many offspring survive to carry on those traits. So the Galapagos Islands are famous because that's supposedly where Darwin came up with this whole idea of natural selection. The Galapagos Islands were only one piece in the puzzle. Now, it is true because they are islands, again, the Galapagos Islands, you have unique island biodiversity, where you have species that exist on one island where they are a little bit different, and actual different species that exist on another island. Now, the HMS Beagle, the ship that Darwin traveled on when he was about 23 years old, went all the way around the Earth. And so he was actually subjected to quite a bit of biodiversity. And the first place that he actually observed that biodiversity was in South America, the rainforests of Brazil. And so he actually came up with that principle, this competition that existed between species. So where is the evidence? What evidence exists that supports the theory of evolution? Well, you are actually exposed to that evidence every day. And it's surprising how much evidence actually exists. I want you just to think about what could be evidence for evolution. What are some commonalities that you share with other organisms? Of course, the first thing you think of are primates. It's easy to see similarities there, but I want you to dig a little bit deeper. Think about what other evidence may exist that actually shows that through a process of changes, small changes over time, that new species are created, but yet they all share a common lineage, a tree, so to speak. And if you follow that tree, by following those traits, then you can find that common ancestor. So let's take a look at some of the examples of evidence of evolution. The first one that we can come up with is structural adaptations. Now, this is talking about the actual physical appearance. Mimicry. I want you to think about a bug that looks like a leaf. I'm sure you've seen them before. How about a bug that looks like a stick? The walking stick bugs. Those are a perfect example of mimicry. They are pretending to be something else. Camouflage would be a little bit different than that. I want you to think about colorations. That is what gives you camouflage. Stripes in a tiger, let it blend into the environment. Stripes on a zebra, let it blend into the environment. And so those structural adaptations, those are examples of evolution in process that took millions of years to happen. You also have physiological adaptations. Now remember, physiology is the actual function of an organism. And so when you have a change in the metabolic processes, the actual chemical and energy producing processes that occur inside of the cells, then you also can have evolution that occurs and new species created that way. I'm sure that you guys are very familiar with the antibiotic resistant bacteria. MRSA is a perfect example of this. And so you can have these metabolic changes, these physiological adaptations. They can happen very, very quickly, as opposed to those physical structural adaptations. Those take millions of years, thousands of generations to occur. And again, remember, bacteria reproduces very quickly, so their generations are going to occur very quickly. If you do the math, you can see that 50 years for a bacteria probably is very similar on a generational time scale to thousands of generations in mammals, in reptiles, and then seeing those small changes over time form new species. During this graph, you can actually see the development of resistance to antibiotics. And so if you're in the healthcare industry, that's always going to be something you have to worry about. But here's a big question. What other industries could be very concerned about bacterial antibiotic resistance? I'll give you the food industry, maybe. Just something to think about. There are other pieces of evidence of evolution. Of course, I'm sure you've all seen fossils. A fossil record, again, we do not have a fossil record of every organism that has ever been on the planet. But any fossil is any trace of a dead organism. Could be bones, could be tracks, could be insects trapped in a tree sap, impressions of leaves. All of those give us clues to what the ancient organisms look like. Now you also have comparative anatomy or homologous structures. Structures such as the tetrapod body plan. Every organism that follows a four-limbed body plan has basically the same skeletal structures. Think of the arm bone. Doesn't matter what organism you're looking at. If it's a tetrapod, it has one big bone, two small bones, a whole bunch of bones, and then digits. Those are homologous structures, and we can follow those down the line. Analogous structures are a little bit different. Easiest way to think of analogous structures are the wings of a bird, the wings of a bat, the fins of a dolphin, the fins of a fish. They are not necessarily on the same lineage, but the structure follows the same function. And so you have speciation that then carries a physical function of a structure that then is carried across in multiple species. You also have vestigial structures. Now, probably the most famous vestigial structure of all would be your appendix. Do you need your appendix? Well, your ancient ancestors did. If you think of another vestigial structure, I want you to think of hips on a whale. Again, why would a whale need hips if it has no back legs? Well, it did at one time. Another piece of evidence would be the evidence of embryos. And in a later lesson, you're going to actually be looking at different embryos and trying to determine what would the species be based on the embryo that you see. And as you'll find out, many of these embryos are extremely similar. In fact, almost all of the vertebrates are very difficult to tell apart. Something to keep in mind, when you are an embryo, such as the one you see on the screen, you have gill slits, just like a fish. Again, sometimes some people say that we are just highly evolved fish. Next would be the evidence of biochemistry. Anybody can think of two things that we share with all life on the planet? I'll give you a couple clues. DNA, RNA. Again, every living organism is built using the same language of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and then adding uracil in the RNA. There is no different pattern anywhere on the planet. So we share that. The original life form started using DNA and RNA, and that system carried down through the years of life on this planet. Also, we use ATP as the energy currency, the actual mechanism of converting those chemical sugars into usable energy by the cell. Again, those DNA genes, those have been passed down for many, many, many generations. So now let's take a look at the actual mechanisms of change. So before we think of these mechanisms, I want you to consider a question. What could cause the genes in one gene pool, meaning all of the genes in that species makeup, to change? Well, easy answer to that. Mutations. Mutations can occur through a natural change. Remember, in the process of replication, you have a mistake that is made basically once every 10 million letters. And so those mutations, sometimes we've talked about mutations, they can be nonsense. They can actually cause new proteins to be built, which would then cause a new trait. And sometimes those changes, they can be caused again through the natural process, or they can be caused through radiation or through exposure to environmental chemicals or pollution. So we have different ways of changing or having those populations or individuals evolve. So here's a big question. Does a population or does an individual evolve? Which one? Well, and here's another one. What is an actual gene pool? Again, the answer to that is all of the genes in that species makeup. Whether you are seeing very many of them, those recessive ones that are there, you still would count those in the gene pool. And then how can that gene pool change? Again, we talked about mutations are an easy way, but you also have genetic drift and you have gene flow. So I want you to think about this. If any of these things happen, which one would they affect more? A large population or a small population? Well, of course, the small population is going to have the biggest effect. So when we're talking about genetic drift, this is when we're talking about having the actual frequencies of those alleles. How many of the recessives, how many of the dominants are suddenly changed by random events in an isolated population. Perfect example happens in the Amish community. The Amish community tend to intermarry within their community, and so they have children within that population. Well, in one case, about 1 in 14 Amish carry a recessive allele for short arms and legs and extra fingers and toes. Outside of the Amish community, about 1 in 1,000 Americans carry the same recessive allele. And so you can see how the gene have changed in that particular population. As far as gene flow, that's actually the transportation of those genes by traveling individuals. So think of migration. When you have groups of species that suddenly go to another population, those genes are lost from its original population, but they are gained in the new population. So now let's move on to natural selection. So natural selection, again, is controlled by the different alleles of a gene. Has variations. We know that there are traits that have lots of variations among individuals. Just think about the individuals in the class. Do we all look the same? Do we all have the same length of arms or legs or size fingers? The amount of muscle mass, the amount of hair on the top of our head, each of those is a trait that then could be selected for or selected against in natural selection. And again, this is nature choosing. Doesn't necessarily mean which is best or which is strongest. It's which one is selected for versus which one is selected against. In a nutshell, natural selection selects the best alleles for a gene that allows the population to better survive in its environment. So if you're thinking of that as a definition, what factors could affect natural selection? Of course, predator-prey relationships, environment, the amount of carrying capacity, the amount of habitat space, the amount of food supply, the amount of potential mating partners. So all of those are factors that could affect natural selection. If you think of the tropical birds, one of the ways that a female selects the mate is the male with the most vibrant colors is the male that is then the most healthy. That is who she would choose. So, as it says, so stabilizing selection always favors an average individual in a population. Think of average sized spiders might be better able to survive than large spiders. They're easily seen by predators. Or the real small spiders. They can't find food easily. Directional selection is going to favor one of the extreme variations of a trait. So think of a long-beaked woodpecker. They might be better able to survive, able to get to the insects deeper in the tree than the short-beaked or the average-beaked woodpecker if insects are living deep in a tree. As far as disruptive selection, that's going to favor individuals with either extreme of the traits. So I want you to think of the far ends of the scale. So white and brown limpets, which are marine organisms, little shellfish-like guys, they blend better than the tan limpets on a light-colored and dark-colored rocks, and therefore they are much more adept at avoiding predators. The tan ones then are removed from the gene pool, and so you have a separation of the species into the two sides. And that's going to lead us into speciation. And again, speciation is the actual process of how new species form from an original species. So, how does speciation occur? Well, again, if we're looking at evolution as the mechanism, evolution of a new species that occurs when members of similar populations no longer have the ability to breed with each other to produce fertile offspring. And so think of how could you have a species that started out originally the same species, maybe two different colored lizards, what could happen that could separate them long enough that they would no longer be able to breed with each other to produce fertile offspring? Now, let's make sure that we keep that point in mind, a fertile offspring. So you've probably seen in the news the zonkies and the cross between the zebra and the donkey, the cross between a horse and a donkey. Well, that gives you a mule. That mule is not fertile. It is a sterile offspring. It cannot reproduce to set forward the traits that it has inherited. And so that would not be considered very fit. So let's think of ways that we could cause species to no longer be able to breed. One of the easiest ways to think of is geographic isolation. So suddenly you have a physical barrier, lava from a volcanic eruption, sea level changes, something like that. It divides the population, makes the gene pool smaller, and each new smaller population adapts to its environment, which then creates new species. Reproductive isolation, that's when organisms can no longer breed with each other to produce fertile offspring because the genes of a population become too different and fertilization cannot occur. Maybe mating times change to different parts of the year. Maybe one population becomes polyploid, meaning that they have more chromosomes due to a mistake in mitosis or meiosis, which makes breeding difficult with the other population. So, how fast can it occur? Well, gradualism is an idea that species originate through a gradual change, small changes long over time, longer than 10,000 years. And if we're looking at fossil evidence, we see that much of the sea life evolves slowly and very steadily over long, long periods of time. Whereas punctuated equilibrium, that's the idea that species originate in rapid bursts, 10,000 years or less, with long periods then of very little change, genetic equilibrium in between. So, fossil evidence shows that higher temperatures and competitive species caused rapid changes to the gene pools of isolated populations. Both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium occur. And so there are two types then of evolution. You have divergent species that were once similar becoming increasingly different, and that happens when populations change as they adapt to different environments. You also have then biodiversity because organisms become very different from each other as they evolve and become better suited to each of their individual environments. Then you have convergent evolution, where you have distantly related organisms evolve similar traits. So think of happens when unrelated species occupy similar environments in different parts of the world. Perfect examples of divergent evolution are the mockingbirds that Darwin found in the Galapagos. Each mockingbird had a little bit different beak. Some of them had curved beaks that were very, very long. Some of them had shorter beaks. Some of them were beaks that were used to crack seeds, so they were very compact. Each of those different beak sizes then had different functions, which then gave that bird an advantage in that particular food source. And the organisms that then had that trait, they were able to survive. The organisms that did not, they were weeded out, and eventually those traits disappeared from that gene pool, and the only traits that show up then would be the traits that you see in the present different species. So take a look at those different birds there. Yeah, they all look very similar to each other, but each of those came from an ancestral finch that had one particular beak size, and then over time, exposure to different environments, little tiny changes in the DNA and the RNA, and simple mutations that happen. Suddenly, you see that speciation occur. An example of convergent evolution, again, let's go back to those analogous structures we talked about. The wings of both a bird and a bat, not made the same way at all. Again, a bat's wings are stretched out basically over its fingers with a flap of skin along its forelimbs. A bird is completely different. That wing, the entire structure is different than what you would find with a bat. However, both wings serve the same function. So you see that trait again where they came from a tetrapod ancestor, but yet those forelimbs from a bat on the mammalian chain developed into wings at for the same function as the wings of a bird developed to allow for flight. So that's taking a good look at some of the evidence that supports Charles Darwin's idea of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Again, natural selection, this process, this competitive process between species, and the whole idea of survival of the fittest, meaning fitness measured by the amount of offsprings that are able to then in turn reproduce themselves to carry those traits down through lines of speciation. We will be digging further into Charles Darwin, looking at the actual voyage he took on the HMS Beagle, as well as looking at some of the other pieces of evidence, the embryos and such, at a later date. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to place them in the comments section. Stay safe, stay home, and wash your hands.